Hello, dear friends. We are back in our As You Prepare series. What I want you to share with you is for the next 3 weeks, we have 3 weekends in between before we begin Lent with Ash Wednesday. And therefore, it's so wonderful that liturgically how these next 3 readings are so well constructed. Especially the second reading of Paul from 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and Luke chapter 6. The second reading and the gospel have got one framework to work on, each of them very specific to each of them. Paul in 1 Corinthians talks about death, resurrection, and how it affects you and I as human persons and believers in Christ. So we will look into that very exclusively 3 weeks from now. Little more on that. The Beatitudes, as we see in Matthew, is reworked very differently, parallel by Luke, what we call Sermon on the Plain. For next 3 weeks, you will see different parts of the Sermon on the Plain by Luke for next 3 weeks to come. And therefore, for the next 3 weeks, the second reading and the gospel reading will be on the similar framework, each respectively. Only the first readings change. Prophet Jeremiah this week, from 1 Samuel the next week of 24th, and then the following week in March, the first weekend of March, it is from the book of Sirach. So I will try to weave you through these 3 weeks and focusing on Luke's sermon on the plain, not Sermon on the Mount, that is Matthew. On Luke, a little more Sermon on the Plain of Jesus this week. Next week, the focus will be more trying to bring both together, especially of Paul and Jesus. The third week, we will see a little more on how Paul talks about death and resurrection, because that will lead us into the season of Lent. Having said that, let's begin with Prophet Jeremiah this weekend. You see, Prophet Jeremiah is a prophet of tremendous volition, emotion, and he is in the southern part of the kingdom, of that land, The northern kingdom of what we spoke many times has been taken away 112, 115 years ago. And Prophet Jeremiah is now at the verge of trying to counsel the king of Judah, whose capital is Jerusalem, where you have the temple. And just before they are being invaded by Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, God tries to talk sense to the king of Judah. Be careful about alliances. Don't trust in human beings. Be careful how you handle this. Otherwise, you will lose your land. Of course, as usual, they don't listen. And wrong alliances, wrong team, wrong kind of a bravery that leads the Babylonians to invade Jerusalem, Judah. The southern kingdom is wiped away. And Prophet Jeremiah is at the verge of that. And that is why Prophet Jeremiah is talking about not trusting in human beings, human persons, not because he has a disdain for them, but he knows that you can trust only in God to be your source. Now that dives us straight into Luke chapter 6, where Luke is looking at Matthew, Sermon on the Mount, and he is rephrasing it, reworking it. Whether he looks at Matthew or not, we don't know, or whether Matthew looks at Luke, we don't know. Most probably they don't know each other, writing differently. But Luke definitely has a particular agenda. In that he brings his beautiful teaching of Jesus. And here if Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, which is more popular, very often Sermon on the Mount of Matthew is very popular, and because of that, we have to emphasize that Luke's Sermon on the Plain is very specific to disciples. In Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, Jesus is in the mountain. For Matthew, Jesus in the mountain like Moses, the new Moses, giving out the new law. For Luke, mountain is a place of prayer. But Jesus comes down to the plain. Therefore, it is Sermon on the Plain, because in the plain is one with the people, among the people, one with the people. Because he's one with them, he's talking to them, and being one with the people, he looks at the disciples to talk to them. He doesn't spiritualize like Matthew saying, blessed are the poor in spirit. He just looks at the disciples and says, blessed are you poor. And so for Luke, the way Jesus talks about the Sermon on the Plain, the Beatitudes, is the Beatitudes of blessing towards the disciples. And when he talks to the disciples, which is very concise, as opposed to the Sermon on the Mount of Matthew, which has got nearly 107 verses, whereas Luke's Beatitudes has just 30 verses. And therefore, for Luke, when he talks, Jesus in Luke is one who talks to the disciples in the now, the daily disciples, the daily living of his disciples. For Luke, the daily living is important. Remember, he says, when Jesus says, take up a cross daily and follow me daily. It's a daily living, here and now. For Luke, the daily living of his disciples is important. And therefore, the daily living of Christian discipleship in Luke is because they are in poverty, in hunger, in grief, in being ostracized, in being humiliated. This happens every day for a disciple of Jesus in his time itself. And therefore, Jesus is talking to his disciples with 4 blessings, and concurrently in opposite to that 4 woes, because my disciples are mine. And in the daily living, in the actual time and now, they go through all these, but there is a blessing for them. And in this blessing that they have, Jesus is talking about and saying, these Beatitudes are only a beginning, a point of departure. But this point of departure of the Beatitudes has to move us towards love. That is the preparation. Therefore, the Beatitudes are in Luke, here and now, daily living, daily struggle, daily grief, daily humiliation, daily poverty, day-to-day living of ostracizing and being shunned by people. But in this daily living of people, you have to move towards love. Love not as saying reciprocating good acts. Oh, I'm a loving person because my friend did this good, I'm doing good to him. It is not being reciprocating good acts or good philanthropy. No. In Jesus, this blessedness in discipleship is calling you forth to a love of people who are our enemies. And that love has to be in action. That love is in action. And therefore, Beatitudes prepare for love on one level. On another level, it has to prepare us for mercy, no judging people. You and I cannot judge people by what we see, what people see. Because external behavior of people is what makes us observe the behavior and say, this is how the person is, this is how she is, this is how he is. And therefore, it is between the movement towards love and towards refraining from judgment is where the blessedness comes. And because of that, giving in abundance to people, being merciful, being good, trying to bring and forgiving people all come together. And therefore, Luke's Sermon on the Plain is a daily call to a disciple so that in that blessedness, you're able to love because you trust only in God. And that is where Luke will come, a daily living of providence for a disciple who, like Prophet Jeremiah, who only wants to trust in God and God alone. My dear friends, may we take the teaching to our hearts. Listen to your, my brother priest and brother deacon, preaching from the pulpit, how this preparation of the word applies to you. May God be with you, especially when you listen to the word proclaimed in the church, in the body and blood of Christ being celebrated in the Eucharist. God will have a word for you. You have to listen, and you're being prepared as you prepare.